in the war. 24 of them on the Allied side and 4 of them on the Central Powers side. Fighting happened in the Balkans and the Caucasus Mountains, the Western Front that I've been talking a lot about. The Atlantic Ocean happened in the Middle East. In fact, a lot of the problems we have today in the Middle East originate from how World War I ended and how World War II ended up following up afterwards. You did have fighting that happened in the Pacific Ocean and in Asia, which not a lot of people think about. You think about the Pacific fighting in World War II, and again, that's because we were involved in it. But you really didn't hear much about it in World War I, but there were German colonies on these different Pacific islands, so the British would fight there, or the French would fight there. You did have a little bit of fighting in South America. Africa was pretty big, and the North Sea. But today I'm going to talk a little bit more about 2 other theaters that the United States was involved in that you probably don't think much about. We were also fighting in Italy and a little bit on the Eastern Front. Oh, moving a little fast. Now, the Italian forces, when the war was going on in Italy, as the Desert Fox. But in 1918, he was only about a lieutenant, and he really was kind of cutting his teeth in the military at that time. Now, this battle in particular, a bigger battle, they called it the Battle of the Isonzo, had been raging on almost from the beginning of the war. And basically, the Austrian-Hungarians would push against the Italians, push them back. The Italians would counterattack, push them back, and it just kept going back and forth. They end up counting over 12 separate battles of the Isonzo over all these years. The Battle of Caporetto was just another part of the 12th Battle of the Isonzo. It was around a small mountain village called Caporetto. So the Italians, they were kind of feeling crushed in defeat and weren't really getting ready to win. The last major attack that the Austrian-Hungarians launched pushed the Italians about 80 miles back. This is one of the biggest gains of the entire war. So the Italians start surrendering in mass numbers and everything. They were not ready to fight. They were just ready to give up. So the British and the French, feeling all the things that were going on the Western Front, were afraid, well, if the Italians get knocked out of this war, then that's going to free up all those Germans and all those Austrian-Hungarians fighting over in Italy to come to the Western Front. And that's going to hurt us. So when the United States got in, they were begging us, hey, can you go help the Italians? Keep them in the fight. So what we did, we sent our troops there, and we had this plan to basically build morale and Americans here showing up. We're not going to be able to fight this. So that's kind of what ended up happening. We ended up leading an attack with the Italians during the Battle of Vittorio Veneto, and the result of this was we broke the Austrian-Hungarians' advances and pushed them back, and we kept chasing after them. And it got so bad that the Austrian-Hungarians asked for an armistice to end the war. Kind of like the famous armistice on November 11th, 1918. This one actually happened at about 3:20 in the afternoon on November 3rd. And it took effect a day later on November 4th. Here's a picture map. I know it's kind of hard to see, but the red line here is the battle line. This is all the Austrian-Hungarian troops coming. Our troops are in the little blue circles, and then we just started basically pushing back. Now I can talk honestly for a whole hour just on the Italians, so I'm kind of trying to move on a little faster. These are some pictures of the Italian front. This is actually an American journalist visiting the troops in the trenches. And yes, there were trenches in Italy. He's got a gas mask. This is something that the Austrian-Hungarians did. They used a lot of poison gas in Italy also. This is an American doughboy in the ruins of a little village. Now, interesting thing about this area of Italy and all this fighting, this was some of the most rugged and rough terrain ever. They were fighting in forests, they were fighting in swamps, they were fighting on plains, then they were fighting up in the mountains, and as they reached higher altitudes in the mountains, it got extremely cold. So they would go to places with one extreme where it was extremely hot and humid, to the next extreme where they're freezing cold and not having enough clothing and gear. Kind of an interesting point. Dave over here, when he served in the Army, he actually was stationed in Italy in the same area that all this happened at. So he can tell you a little bit about how the land is. But the picture here, these are American doughboys marching up to the front, and they kind of look weird. The reason why is they're wearing mosquito nets. Again, I was telling you, kind of a swampy area, hot, humid, mosquitoes. This is along the Piave River. Is that how you pronounce it? Piave. A couple more pictures here in the trenches. Here they are throwing hand grenades towards the Austrian-Hungarians. But the final result of all this was the Americans helped the Italians defeat the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. And our advance actually led us into Austria-Hungary. At the end of the war, the 332nd Infantry Regiment was broken up into different battalions stationed in different places, and one of them was even in Vienna, Austria. So we were starting to move quite a ways and gather a lot of land. This effectively knocked, like I said, Austria-Hungary out of the war. So with Austria-Hungary out of the war, Germany is pretty much fighting on its own. You also still had the Ottoman Empire, who was falling out of the war about the same time. And Germany couldn't get support. So overall strategy, this is helping win the overall war. Now, I'm going to tell you a couple other places. This is something that's really not even talked about or known. But I talked a little bit last week about the Russian Revolution. In 1917, the Russians were hurting very bad. They didn't have enough weapons, enough ammunition, and enough food to support their army. They had probably the largest army of the entire war. But it doesn't help if you have 10 guys and every 6 of them only have a rifle and everyone else doesn't. The fighting was so bad in Russia, and the conditions in Russia, just the way the society worked, you had a lot of extremely wealthy people, in particular the monarch, the Tsar. And then you had the extremely poor people. There was no middle class. This caused revolt, which was the Russian Revolution. The Bolsheviks, they came in and they said, you know, why does the rich need to have everything and the poor have nothing? It should be equal. They kind of indoctrinated a system of socialism. They wanted the government to control everything and distribute it to everybody so everybody would have something equally. So the Bolsheviks end up overthrowing the Tsar and setting up a new government, a communist government. So Russia became communist. I told you that the Russian communist government then went and signed a treaty with the Germans, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, ending Russia out of the war, which freed all the Germans up to go fight on the Western Front. Well, something that was going on, because we knew that the Russian army was hurting for gear and equipment and supplies. The Allies were supplying extra gear and equipment to the Russians. They were sending them tanks, they were sending them planes, they were sending them rifles. Here in the United States, there were 2 companies, Remington Manufacturing and Westinghouse, we were building Russian rifles, sending them to the Russians. We have both a Remington Mosin-Nagant and a Westinghouse Mosin-Nagant made here in the United States on display in the back room. Well, now that this has became a communist country, we needed to kind of protect all those weapons and gear and supply that we gave the Russians and keep them out of the hands of the communists. So we started sending troops, the British first, followed by the Americans. And we went to a little port town called Archangel in northern Russia. We sent about 5,000 troops there. And their whole job was nothing but to protect our equipment and gear and keep them out of the hands of the Russians. So this was what we called the North American, or the American Northern Russian Expeditionary Force. They were kind of nicknamed polar bears, being all the way up in northern Russia. So they kind of had the insignias of polar bears on their gear and equipment. They primarily came out of the 85th Division. They were different regiments, the 339th Infantry Regiment and the 310th Engineers. They were there for about 9 months, and they suffered just a little under 200 people dead, captured, killed, missing. And we did have a little bit of fighting here and there against the Bolsheviks. Their main objectives, as I said, was to protect the Allied war material that we were giving Russia. Now, another thing, there was a group called the Czech Legion. The Czech Legion was another Allied nation who was fighting with the Russians against the Germans. Well, now that the Bolsheviks took over, the Bolsheviks started fighting against the Czech Legion. And we kind of had to go and help them and save them. Kind of think of this as a rescue mission. They were stranded along the Trans-Siberian Continental Railroad. And we basically were trying to get them. The guy in charge of this was a General Graves, was his name. And these are actually reenactment photos here of what they kind of did. They'd go house to house searching for Bolsheviks and looking for where weapons are being hidden. Here's some actual photos. The troops landing off the ships. You can see they're in northern Russia, all the heavy snow. Gun over here, this is a British Vickers machine gun, and they were learning how to shoot that and teaching the Russians how to operate them. A couple soldiers. For the most part, the Northern Russian expedition pretty much just stayed right there in Archangel. Every time we would try to go rescue the Czech Legion, we'd get into some fights and battles with the Bolsheviks, and we couldn't really go and reach them. So, even despite General Pershing's protest, he didn't agree with this. This came from an order straight from President Woodrow Wilson. We ended up sending another expedition into Russia. And trying to get to that slide. Yeah, there's a picture of General Graves. This is all, by the way, from another presentation I've done just on all of this. So, like I said, I could talk a full hour just on Italy and Russia. And I'm trying to add a little more to this for you guys. There you go. The Siberian expedition. Now, give you an idea of this map of Russia here. Archangel's way up here along the North Sea. We decided the Trans-Siberian Continental Railroad ran all the way across Russia. The Czech legions lost somewhere in the middle of Siberia. Every time we would send our troops out of Archangel to go get them, they'd get fought and met up by the Bolsheviks and couldn't go get it. So what we decided to do is we would send our troops from the west coast of the United States across the Pacific Ocean. Here's Japan. And we would land in a little town called Vladivostok. And we would travel up the Trans-Siberian Railroad from Vladivostok to rescue the Czech Legion. Now, another thing, and this is kind of important, one of the groups of allies that landed at Vladivostok with the United States, this wasn't just us, we had British, we had French, we had Japanese. The Japanese were an allied country in World War I. And I'm going to get back to that in a little bit when I talk about the Treaty of Versailles. But getting back to the Siberian expedition, we had basically 2 infantry regiments go. We had really about 10,000 men. So you had twice the number that was in Archangel landing in Vladivostok. And the 2 regiments were primarily the 27th Infantry Regiment and the 31st Infantry Regiment. We have a 31st Infantry Regiment summer uniform on display in the back room. Now, once we got there, you know, we were again doing the same thing as we were in Archangel, supplying equipment and gear. We marched through the city, and we started moving up the Trans-Siberian Continental Railroad to rescue the Czech Legion. We got into multiple fights with the Bolsheviks again, just like Archangel, but we had more people there, and we had other allied countries helping us. So we were able to rescue the Czech Legion of between 40 and 50,000 men and get them out of Russia and get them back over to Europe and France and fight along the Western Front with the French. The last thing we were kind of doing, we really didn't trust the Japanese. The Japanese had a bit of an aggression towards Russia. Back in 1900, 1905, that time period, Japan fought a big war against Russia called the Russo-Sino War, or the Russo-Japanese War. I've heard it pronounced different ways. The result was Japan won that war, and they were fighting the Russians in the area of Manchuria, modern-day Korea. And this really kind of set the stage for Japan, because Japan became a big powerhouse country in the world at that time. And they were really wanting to have a lot of territorial gains, control parts of China, control part of Russia. Now all of a sudden, 1918, we're in Russia with the Japanese, and we're all supposed to be on the same side. And Russia and Japan are kind of bitter enemies still. So we had to really kind of watch our friend Japan and what they were doing. A couple pictures here are soldiers' equipment unloading off of ships, marching through cities. Our soldiers would actually dress a little bit like Russians. They would adopt the funny Russian hats and everything. Here's some pictures of our troops marching out along the Trans-Siberian Railroad to go fight the Bolsheviks. And this is my favorite one. This is along the Trans-Siberian Continental Railroad. Of course, you can see the locomotive here and the railroad. This guy right here, this is an American soldier. This guy right here is a Japanese. There were a few incidences, just minor, nothing serious, where Americans and the Japanese would actually get into arguments, and it would lead into fighting. It didn't happen very much. Our soldiers kind of had orders not to engage in fighting with the Japanese, but it did happen. The Japanese would get upset and shoot at us. Our guys ain't going to stand around and get shot at, so they'd shoot back. And then somebody would have to say, hey, wait, we're supposed to be on the same side here, guys. Now, the entire time we were over in Russia, we were there from 1918 until 1920, well after World War I ended. So a lot of people question, why were we even there? You know, we were there to protect the gear and equipment that we were given the Tsarist Russians while they were in the war, to keep that gear and equipment to come into the Bolsheviks. You can kind of even make a slight bit of an argument. This was the beginning, the very beginning of the Cold War that really blew up right after the end of World War II, with the Soviet Union defeating Germany. But the sad thing is, to this day, there are still Americans who were killed fighting the Bolsheviks in Russia, who are buried over in Russia. And when it was all over and done with, all the American soldiers coming home, they all kind of scratched their heads and wondered why. Why was we even there to begin with? We really did nothing. We basically got there and camped out and kept other Russians from getting the gear that we told them that we were going to give them. Now, getting back to this is back on the Western Front, the Treaty of Versailles. The Treaty of Versailles is what officially ended World War I. Now, there's a lot of interesting things about this. The Treaty of Versailles was signed in the famous Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles in France, just outside of Paris. And this is a picture of the Hall of Mirrors. It was established or based on a couple different things, and it was basically to provide a lasting peace, ending the war. It was based on President Woodrow Wilson's 14 points, but there was a lot of things that happened that kind of went bad. You know, first we created Poland. We created a League of Nations. This was the forerunner to the United Nations. And it basically said, you know, there was no more secret alliances being allowed to happen. That's what happened to cause World War I in a way. Remember I told you, Russia had a secret alliance with France. Germany with a secret alliance with Austria-Hungary. So when the war broke out, it started pulling all these countries into the war because everybody had a secret alliance. The biggest thing I want to talk about with the Treaty of Versailles is it had what was called a war guilt clause. The war guilt clause basically blamed Germany solely for the entire war. Now, I'm going to ask you guys real quick, do you think that's fair? You guys remember how the war broke out? Was Germany really the one that kind of started the war? Nonetheless, because all the fighting that happened on the Western Front between Great Britain and France and Germany, the British and the French were very vindictive, and they basically said, you're the reason for this whole war, Germany, and because you guys caused this war, we're going to do everything we can to punish you. We're going to start charging you guys war tariffs, war reparations. You have to pay for the whole cost of the war. Last year, Germany finally paid off that debt. They had been paying it ever since 1918. It was in the sum of several $billion today, accounting for inflation. Germany also lost territory. They had gained the lands of Alsace-Lorraine from France during the Franco-Prussian War. And I told you guys that when the war broke out, France wanted that land back. Well, France got the land back. In addition, French got to control the German Rhineland. They broke the Rhineland up into 3 different areas of occupation. You had the British occupation zone, the French occupation zone, and the American occupation zone. It also basically told the Germany, you're not allowed to build up a military anymore. You have to destroy all your tanks, all your planes, all your machine guns, all your big artillery. You're not allowed to have a military anymore. When all these rules were laid out for Germany, Bernhard Foch basically looked at this and he saw how vindictive the Allied politicians were, and he prophetically stated This is not peace, but this is an armistice to last only 20 years. 21 years later, World War II broke out, almost because of everything that was laid out in the Versailles Treaty. Here's Wilson's 14 points. It said open diplomacy, freedom of the sea. Remember, we got into the war because of the sinking of Allied ships. Removal of economic barriers. Reduction of armaments, okay? You know, we had this massive arms race leading up to the war. Now let's get rid of weapons. Adjustment of colonial claims. Well, I told you guys that all these countries had colonies before the war. Now they have to get rid of colonies. Conquered territories in Russia had to kind of be given back up to the Russians, which were now the Bolsheviks, now Soviet Union. So you get the formation of countries like Latvia, Belarus, Lithuania. All these countries that the Germans will invade in World War II. The preservation of Belgium's sovereignty. Remember, I was telling you the United States was helping aid the Belgians. Germany's basically invaded Belgium at the beginning of the war to fight against France without even having any plans or even asking Belgium, hey, can we go through your guys' land? The division of Austria-Hungary. You can kind of read the list there. Here's those nations and kind of a political cartoon. They're saying, you know, that they're never going to collect. Here's the occupation of the Rhineland. Again, I was telling you, the British had a northern sector, the French had the center, we had the southern sector. You'll see the same kind of thing happen again at the end of World War II after we defeat Nazi Germany. We all divide Germany itself up into all these sectors, a British, a French, an American, and a Soviet sector. And then the city of Berlin itself is divided the same way. Now, traditionally the war, as I said, was the armistice took effect the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. The Paris peace talks is what started the Treaty of Versailles, and it happened in 1919. It actually happened in January. By June 28, 1919 is when the Treaty of Versailles was signed. Here's one of those interesting things. Germany really didn't get to sign it. Germany looked at all these conditions and all this stuff and they said, we're not signing that, we don't agree with that. Well, the Allies basically turned around and said, look, you're signing this regardless. We're making you, because if you don't sign it, we're going to roll our armies right on into Germany and destroy everything you have. So the Germans were like, okay, we'll abide by it. But they never officially signed it. Now, when World War II breaks out, this is something that Hitler will use, because he kind of says, well, look, you know, Germany never agreed to all this. We never signed this. So when the World War II is leading up, Hitler is pushing the limits constantly. He starts invading all these territories that they were given up by Austria-Hungary, such as the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia, and then Austria itself. And then he reoccupies the Rhineland. He starts secretly building up a new military. All this is the stuff that the Treaty of Versailles says that he can't do. And he basically turned around and says, who says I can't? We never signed it. We never agreed to it. What are you going to do? He was basically pushing the limits of what the British and the French would do. Here in the United States, however, you know, the bulk of the Treaty of Versailles was based on President Wilson's plans. But the president can't sign a treaty. It has to be ratified through Congress. And the Congress was Republican controlled. They looked at this, and we didn't agree with a lot of the terms and conditions ourselves. So we never ratified it. We never signed the Treaty of Versailles ourselves. We had to sign a separate peace treaty with Germany, ending World War I for the United States. And that was called the Knox-Porter Resolution. And that didn't happen until 1921. So you can honestly argue World War I for the United States happened from 1917 to 1921, but all fighting ended November 11th, 1918. Now, I'm wrapping up here today, but I want to tell you a couple of lasting effects about World War I. It is considered one of the largest global conflicts of the world. It had about roughly 10 million people killed in the war. The Russians lost the most, followed by France and Germany. We only had about 117,000 Americans killed directly because of the war. But this was an everlasting thing. You hear about incidences again in World War II, such as the Holocaust. There were their own Holocausts that happened in World War I. The Ottoman Empire attacked southeastern Europe and the Balkan states, and they committed a genocide against Armenians. So they call it the Armenian Genocide. It wasn't at the level of the Nazi Holocaust against the Jews, but it did happen. Again, the aftermath, I told you about how the Germans didn't agree to the conditions of the Treaty of Versailles. A lot of the individual German soldiers felt that they never lost the war. Their government sold them out. So they formed this theory, they call it the stab in the back theory. Again, this guy will take this stab in the back theory and lead it on into World War II. This gentleman right here with the mustache next to the dog, this is a German corporal. That is Adolf Hitler. That is who will become the dictator of Nazi Germany. It's also kind of said in a way because World War I changed everything. When the war broke out, the soldiers and the armies, they rode into the war riding on horseback. Well, due to mechanization, industrialism, they came out of the war riding on tanks and planes. You had new weapons, new technologies, new tactics, everything. And you'll see all this stuff kind of start to build up and repeat in World War II. The British and the French in particular, really, when World War II break out, they anticipate it being an absolute repeat of the First World War. They start building defenses, they start building trenches, and World War II is fought completely different. World War II was fought as a war of mobility. The Germans surprised them with the Blitzkrieg and just ran right over all their defenses and trenches. A couple little notes too, and it's hard to think about this, but some effects that we still feel today in World War I. You had some everyday science and technology, and even fashion came out of World War I. Soldiers, especially officers, would wear a new type of coat in the trenches to protect themselves from the mud and the rain and keep them warm. They called them trench coats. You still have trench coats that are worn today as fashion. Especially men in business, they'll wear a trench coat. When World War I started, only ladies would wear wrist watches. Men would wear pocket watches. Well, they started changing because of the war. A soldier couldn't hold his rifle and pick out his pocket watch out of his vest to look to see what time it was, so he'd start wearing a wristwatch just like the ladies. Pilots who were flying, same thing. They couldn't control that joystick on the plane, pull out a pocket watch. They'd wear a wristwatch where they can look. So wristwatches started coming in. It's a fashion. You start hearing terminology you still use today, such as in the trenches, meaning to struggle with something horrible or bad, or going over the top. You know, soldiers coming out of the trenches leading their attacks. There's a lot that happened from World War I, and like I've said, it changed everything the world wide over. And all this stuff will start repeating again in World War II to a higher level, making it even worse. The battles weren't as big and grandiose in World War II as they were in World War I. You didn't have millions of men fighting in one battle so much. You had a lot of that on the Eastern Front, but you start having different technologies. by the end of 1945, at the end of World War II, almost 65 million people worldwide will have been killed just from World War II. You had about 60 million people involved in World War I, and about 10 million died. So it's getting close. I've always have kind of said, when you think about it and start comparing the two world wars, whatever number statistic you have for World War I, times it by 4, and that's what you have in World War II. So I'm going to call it quits today, and if you guys have questions, please feel free to ask.